joined me here a couple of times to comment on films after you folks have watched them. Raoul Walsh, as I indicated on the paper that I handed out to you, pretty good example of somebody who probably should be a lot better known than he is. I'll ask you a pointed question about directors. A famous movie, Casablanca. Who directed it? Anybody know? Famous. If I asked you who directed Citizen Kane, would you know that one? Of course. Well, this is my point, I guess, with this series, is that even though there are films that you might recognize as existing, you may not have any clue as to who directed them. Michael Curtiz did Casablanca, and he literally did dozens of movies at Warner Brothers and at other studios when Warner Brothers thought that Mr. Curtiz's career was pretty much over. Raoul Walsh did quite a few films at Warner Brothers also. And it's really rather odd, I think, that in Leonard Maltin's classic movie guide, which covers from the silent era until 1965, there's a directory of movie stars and directors at the back of the book. Walsh isn't included. But yet, if you look at the list of films that Walsh directed, it's pretty impressive. He directed over 100 features in about a 50-year period. And it started back in 1914, silent era. In 1915, he was an assistant to D.W. Griffith in creating Birth of a Nation. And he also portrayed John Wilkes Booth in that film. Walsh goes on in the silent era to do things like The Thief of Baghdad with Douglas Fairbanks, What Price Glory with Victor McLaglen, Sadie Thompson with Gloria Swanson. Graduating into the sound era, The Big Trail should have been the start of John Wayne's career. It was almost the end of his career. Unfortunately, for reasons only the public knows, it didn't queue up to that movie. Even though today, if you watch it, it's not the best Western that was created at that time period, but it deserved a lot more credit than apparently it got at the time. And with its failure, Wayne, unfortunately, was relegated to B-movie status. And for the next decade, practically, was involved with B-westerns, pretty much, until John Ford put him in a little movie called Stagecoach, and all of a sudden a new era for John Wayne opened up. The Bowery in 1933 with Wallace Beery and George Raft. Klondike Annie, Mae West, 1939, possibly one of the best movies about the Roaring Twenties, was called The Roaring Twenties, and it starred James Cagney. High Sierra in 1941 introduced Humphrey Bogart into stardom. Really, it just predated The Maltese Falcon by just a short period of time, but it definitely showed Bogart was quite capable of starring in and carrying a movie of some importance. Walsh was thoroughly aligned with another actor at Warner Brothers called Errol Flynn. And Errol Flynn, I think it was at least a half a dozen movies that Walsh directed with he in them. Two very prominent ones, They Died with Their Boots On, in which Flynn portrayed George Custer, and Objective Burma, which is a dynamite World War II film with Errol Flynn. 1947, a very moody Western called Pursued, starred Robert Mitchum. White Heat, Cagney, again, is directed by Raoul Walsh in really as strong a gangster movie as you're ever liable to see, White Heat. James Cagney is the epitome of evil in that movie. And he had a good mentor in his mother in that film. She was a nasty individual also. Captain Horatio Hornblower in 51, 1955, a war movie called Battle Cry with Van Heflin, and in 1958 another war movie that was written by Norman Mailer, if I remember correctly, The Naked and the Dead, with Aldo Ray, Raymond Massey, a stalwart cast of actors. Some of the other things that Walsh was responsible for, which may not have been in the same criteria and importance as what I just mentioned. From 1955 through 1958, Walsh directed Clark Gable in 3 films, The Tall Men, King and Four Queens, and Band of Angels. He also did some light stuff, too. One of them was called The Horn Blows at Midnight in 1945. And that was a little ditty that starred Jack Benny, who was an angel sent back to Earth to pretty much obliterate it at midnight by blowing a horn. Another unique Walsh film, Distant Drums in 1951, starred Gary Cooper and was primarily shot in the Florida Everglades on location. And one thing which I hope you will remember from the radio program, that was the first movie to introduce to the public the Wilhelm scream.
Oh. Yeah.
Do you know what that is? It's a noise which is created by somebody usually dying or in the throes of pretty much going to die momentarily if they've dove off of a high place or have been stabbed or run over or something. That's been used approximately 150 times in films. Star Wars, Indiana Jones.
It's the same scream, that's the thing. They
It's
just use it over and over and over.
It's the same scream. It's like a sound effect, a door opening or footsteps. It's called the Wilhelm scream. Strangely enough, not from Distant Drums. And I think the guy who was responsible, or at least it was the character in, was a fellow by the name of Sheb Wooley. Sheb Wooley did a song called The Purple People Eater, which you might remember.
Oh, yeah.
And he was also one of the villainous men who congregated to do in Gary Cooper in High Noon, Sheb Wooley. And a movie called Gun Fury in 1953 starred Rock Hudson, and that was done in 3D. Walsh did like 3 movies with Rock Hudson. The Lawless Breed, Sea Devils, and Gun Fury. And an aside here, in 1929, Walsh lost an eye in a bizarre incident while scouting locations for in Old, Arizona. A jackrabbit jumped through a car windshield that he was an occupant of, lost an eye. And from that point on, he always wore an eye patch. He could have joined John Ford, who late in his career wore an eye patch. A director who we're going to do here in a couple of weeks, Andre de Toth, only had one eye. And the strange thing about de Toth and Walsh, Walsh being the director of Gun Fury in 3D, he could have never seen the movie in the 3D format because he only had one eye. Rebecca, it's your turn. what have you got to offer here as far as, do you know anything about Raoul Walsh at all?
Not other than what you just mentioned. I feel
Okay.
like I'm an expert now.
Gregory Peck or Virginia Mayo, anything
Well,
to,
This is only my second Gregory Peck movie I've ever seen. When I was I was just telling Barry this story. When I was a kid, I was really weird. I liked things that my friends didn't like, and something I really liked is my parents had taped Moby Dick off of the television, and I used to like watch that tape over and over. I don't know, I really liked it. So I'm happy to see Gregory Peck in another film. It's another nautical film, but it's still good.
Walsh also directed Gregory Peck as a sailor in a movie called The World in His Arms, which was 1953 at Universal International. And Gregory Peck definitely, in my mind, do you have, but you've only seen two, so you have no association with To Kill a Mockingbird.
No, because I refuse to see that movie till I read the book, and I have not read the book yet.
Okay. Well, I think in most minds, Gregory Peck is thoroughly associated as Atticus Finch. Atticus Finch, sure. Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird in 1962. And Gregory Peck was in 50 feature films, notably 12 O'Clock High, The Gunfighter, Roman Holiday, great little movie that purportedly introduced Audrey Hepburn, but Audrey Hepburn had been in a couple of movies before that, sequestered in the cast, not the least of which was The Lavender Hill Mob. She was a girlfriend that Alec Guinness had down in South America or wherever he took off to when he had his gold Eiffel Towers melted down. Cape Fear, Peck, and a very menacing Robert Mitchum, and a very menacing Gregory Peck appeared in Boys from Brazil.
Oh, I've actually seen that one. I have seen another movie.
Three.
Yes, I remember three now.
Okay. Very, very, not a typical Peck part. Gregory Peck was usually cast in the heroic mold, or the hero, or the good guy. He was born Eldred Gregory Peck, E-L-D-R-E-D, which he hated. He disliked that name. So much so that when he became, or when he was being sized up as an actor, he wanted to be known as Gregory Peck, no Eldred whatsoever. Virginia Mayo, a young lady who had kind of a curious eye problem. She was slightly cross-eyed and had to be photographed very carefully so that you didn't detect that, I think it must have been the right eye would wander towards her nose more often than not. And if it was caught improperly by the camera, she would look cross-eyed. She was directed also by Walsh in a couple of movies, White Heat being one of them with Cagney, and another one called Colorado Territory, which was actually a remake of High Sierra, the Humphrey Bogart movie from 1941, and Colorado Territory was 1949, the same year as White Heat. Virginia Mayo was an incredibly popular actress from about the mid-40s to the mid-50s, appearing with Bob Hope, Danny Kaye, Kirk Douglas, James Cagney, Burt Lancaster, and Alan Ladd. Oddly enough, Virginia Mayo said that the actor that she enjoyed most appearing with, and she was in a couple of movies with him, was Alan Ladd. Thought he was a gentleman and a good actor to play off of in a film. Unlike a lot of people in the movie business, she was married to one fellow, a guy by the name of Michael O'Shea, who she met early in her acting career in the 1940s. They were married for 25 years until O'Shea's passing. That's it from me.
Well, for me, I mean, one last thing I'd like to mention about the film that stuck out for me is sometimes I think when you look at films that were done in the 50s or 60s with a contemporary eye, sometimes battle scenes can look a little corny. This one, I don't think so. I think it was suspenseful. I really enjoyed the part where he was around Panama and they had the two ships that were circling each other and fighting. I thought it was great. I think it really holds up like you were mentioning.
And it does have a light touch to it.
Yeah, when Gregory Peck smiles, it throws you off a little bit, at least for me.
Yeah, and of course the bit of business about the throat clearing and the wagering amongst his officers as to how he was either going to react to certain situations, or if indeed certain proclamations that he had made were going to happen, that the wind was going to come up and we were definitely going to see land, seemed like pretty much a dream to a goodly percentage of the crew, but his first officer there had a little bit of a read on Captain Horatio Hornblower and figured that it was worthy of a wager, and without fail, as far as the movie is concerned, he didn't lose. He won every time. So I hope you enjoyed this, folks. Have you any questions, Mr. Whitman?
Was that Christopher Lee, when he was the captain of the Spanish ship? That looked
It
Yeah,
definitely was.
it looked like him, yeah.
Christopher Lee, who just died here earlier this year, he had an incredible career in the movies, and it did start in roles like this. It took Hammer Films and an association with Peter Cushing in Curse of Frankenstein. He played the Mummy, he played Dracula, and they were paired in dozens of films. And Lee ended up being one of the villains there in one of the Bond movies, even. And this is one. Not the earliest role. I think you could probably chart him back into the late 40s, Christopher Lee. But I think he lived to mid-90s, if I remember correctly, 93, 94. Really, and active almost up to his death. It was he. Yes, sir.
Sorry, by your dates here, he lived another 23 years after 58. Do you happen to know, did he work after
No, he
that?
retired in 1964. Some of the movies that he was associated with towards the end of Walsh's career were not the best. There's a movie called Marines Let's Go, which is very dismissible. The last film that he was associated with was a decent Western called A Distant Trumpet, which pretty face male from Warner Brothers. I'm not going to remember what the guy's name was. Suzanne Plachette was in it also, but not a memorable movie. So he probably lived several years after he retired. But if it started in 1914 and ended in 1964, and it encompassed about 150 films, or 100 films. He was a pretty active guy. Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to make a comment about the power of those studios. I'm sure everybody noticed that Gregory Peck was being used with the permission of David O. Selznick.
Yep.
And so this was obviously a loan-out project for Gregory Peck, but he obviously was not a Warner Brothers person. And
He was in a couple of Warner Brothers movies at this time, though. And,
yeah, I'm wondering if those are more loan-out projects.
again, I don't remember. I remember because I just saw this, but there was one about the same time. I think it was 1951. It was a really crummy Western called Only the Valiant. He co-starred with a woman who had an incredible career on screen and off, a woman by the name of Barbara Payton, who had a very unfortunate life after her star faded somewhat. Ended up, I think she was a prostitute at the end of her life. Drugs and alcohol, not pleasant. And just prior to this, Peck would be in The Gunfighter, which was 1950. And I don't remember any, I don't know why they had to have that designation here, but that was quite prominent with David O. Selznick.
Yes, exactly.
He apparently was just scrupulous enough to want to have his name mentioned if somebody was under contract
To him.
to him. I think,
Because
I'm trying,
they could stop projects if somebody wanted one of their actors and they wanted, the other studio wasn't willing to loan them. And it was kind of interesting to see
yeah,
that.
that was the charm and the drawback of the studio system. You had a home, they would supply you with films to be in. More often than not, it was calculated so that it would best define or reflect your personality, whatever way they were trying to mold the person, whether it be male or female. But then sometimes the projects seemed by the personalities as not really suitable, and they would rebel sometimes. I remember Cagney left Warner Brothers, Betty Davis did for a short period of time because they were just sick and tired of what Jack Warner and his crew were asking them to be in. They drifted back eventually and probably got a little bit of a stronger hand as to what they did appear in. But more often than not, and Selznick wasn't really attached to a studio. He was a producer of films.
Right.
And he was associated kind of strongly with Alfred Hitchcock. I think he was influential in getting Hitchcock over here, as I think Rebecca Selznick may have had a hand in that, if I'm remembering correctly. But no, it was good times and bad times as far as actors and studios were concerned. But you can spot that periodically, every once in a while. I don't think you'd ever see that today, that sort of crowd.
No.
I don't think anybody's got that amount of power today to ask or even demand it.
I would imagine there's also civil rights issues in there as well, and the whole way the contract is written. So, yeah.
Okay. Folks, thank you very much. Next week, as it was implied earlier, going to do Dark of the Sun. That's going to be followed by the Andre Dutoff movie Crime Wave with Sterling Hayden and Phyllis Kirk, and a guy who probably most associated with song and dance movies, Gene Nelson, who is a pretty good dramatic actor, and he proves his worth in that movie, if none other. So please come back.
Is that
I'd
at 4
appreciate it.
o'clock again?
Yeah, this is the only oddball thing, and it was